The metallic clang of handcuffs echoed through the quiet house like a death knell, shattering the fragile illusion of normalcy. Ngozi stood frozen in the doorway of her father's bedroom, tears streaming down her face as two uniformed officers led him away. His eyes locked onto hers, wide with disbelief and betrayal, searching for answers she couldn't give. "Ngozi," he pleaded, his voice trembling, "please tell them the truth." But the truth was buried deep beneath layers of shame, anger, and desperation. And Ngozi wasn't ready to unearth it. Not yet. It had all started so innocently, or so she told herself. Growing up, her mother was always absent, jetting off to Dubai, London, or New York for business trips that seemed never-ending. Her father, Emeka, became her entire world. He was the one who tucked her in at night, helped her with homework, and took her out for ice cream when she aced a test. To Ngozi, he wasn't just a parent. He was her hero, her confidant, her everything. But over time something shifted. Innocent affection turned into something darker, more complicated. She began dressing differently around him, lingering in his room longer than necessary, finding excuses to touch him. A hand on his arm here, a hug that lasted too long there. And then came the night she crossed a line she could never uncross. When he rejected her, disgust etched across his face, something inside Ngozi snapped. Humiliated and enraged, she lashed out in the worst way possible. A single WhatsApp message to her group chat spiraled into a lie that destroyed their lives forever. Now, as the police car pulled away from the curb, Ngozi sank to her knees, clutching her phone tightly in her hand. On the screen was the damning text she had sent just hours earlier. "My dad tried to hurt me." Her friends' replies flooded in, urging her to report him, validating her fabricated story. But as Ngozi stared at the messages, nausea churned in her stomach. What had she done? And more importantly, could she ever take it back? To the outside world, the Okafor family appeared picture-perfect. Dr. Emeka Okafor was a respected pediatrician known for his kindness and dedication, while Chioma Okafor was a high-powered entrepreneur whose import-export business took her across continents. Their daughter, Ngozi, was bright and ambitious, excelling in school and admired by her peers. But behind closed doors, the cracks were undeniable. Chioma's constant travels left a void in their home that no amount of money could fill. When she was away, which was often, Emeka stepped into the role of both parents, juggling work and parenting with quiet resilience. For Ngozi, this meant spending countless evenings curled up next to him on the couch, watching old Nollywood films or sharing plates of jollof rice and plantains. "You're my girl," Emeka would say with a smile, ruffling her hair. "Always remember that." And for a long time those words were enough. They filled the emptiness left by Chioma's absence, making Ngozi feel seen and loved in ways her mother never did. But as she entered her teenage years, those feelings began to shift in ways she didn't fully understand. Chioma's rare appearances at home only made matters worse. When she returned from her trips, she brought expensive gifts. A designer handbag for Ngozi, a new watch for Emeka, but these tokens felt hollow compared to the emotional connection Ngozi craved. Once, during an argument, Ngozi screamed at her mother, "You don't even care about us. You're too busy chasing your stupid career." Chioma had sighed wearily, shaking her head. "One day, you'll understand what sacrifice means, Ngozi. Until then, stop acting like a spoiled child." That comment haunted Ngozi for weeks. Spoiled. Was that how her mother saw her? The thought gnawed at her, fueling resentment toward Chioma and deepening her reliance on Emeka. Unbeknownst to her, this dynamic would set the stage for something far more destructive. As Ngozi grew older, her attachment to Emeka became increasingly noticeable. At first, it seemed harmless. She'd sit closer to him on the couch than necessary, rest her head on his shoulder during movies, or insist on accompanying him to the market. But soon, subtle changes began creeping into their interactions. One evening, after returning from a shopping trip with her friends, Ngozi modeled a new dress for Emeka. It was shorter and tighter than anything she'd worn before, and she twirled self-consciously in front of him. "What do you think, Dad?" she asked, biting her lip nervously. Emeka raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the outfit. "It's different," he said diplomatically. "Are you sure it's appropriate for school?" "It's fine," Ngozi snapped, suddenly defensive. "Everyone wears stuff like this." Later that night, she caught herself staring at her reflection in the mirror, wondering if Emeka had noticed how much effort she'd put into looking good for him. The realization startled her, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. After all, he was her father. There was nothing wrong with wanting his approval, right? Over the next few weeks, Ngozi found herself going out of her way to seek his attention. She started cooking breakfast for him every morning, carefully plating scrambled eggs and toast with a side of fresh orange juice. She ironed his shirts, humming softly as she worked, imagining how impressed he'd be when he saw how crisp they looked. Evenings became sacred rituals where they'd sit together in comfortable silence, watching TV or discussing her day. But beneath the surface, Ngozi's emotions were anything but simple. She began fantasizing about moments that went beyond the boundaries of a typical father-daughter relationship, imagining him holding her hand, brushing her hair, or telling her she was special in ways that felt dangerously intimate. Each fantasy left her feeling guilty yet exhilarated, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting desires. Unaware of her inner turmoil, Emeka continued treating her with the same paternal affection he always had. To him, she was still his little girl, the bright, curious child who used to beg him to read bedtime stories. If he noticed any change in her behavior, he dismissed it as typical teenage moodiness. For now, Ngozi kept her growing feelings hidden, burying them under layers of denial. But deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time before the dam broke, and when it did, there would be no turning back. Ngozi's behavior grew bolder as her feelings for Emeka intensified. What had once been subtle hints of affection began to manifest in ways that were impossible to ignore. She started dressing more provocatively around him, not just when going out with friends but even at home. One evening, she emerged from her room wearing a tight tank top and shorts, her hair styled in loose waves. "Do I look okay?" she asked casually, leaning against the kitchen counter where Emeka was preparing dinner. He glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable. "You look fine," he said, turning back to the pot on the stove. "But maybe cover up a bit more if you're staying indoors." Ngozi flushed, equal parts embarrassed and frustrated. Why didn't he see her? Why couldn't he acknowledge the effort she put into looking good for him? Her frustration boiled over later that night when they sat together watching television. Ngozi scooted closer to him on the couch, resting her head on his shoulder. When he instinctively wrapped an arm around her, she leaned into his touch, savoring the warmth of his embrace. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that this was something more, that they weren't just father and daughter, but two people who loved each other deeply. But reality came crashing down when Emeka gently pulled away, clearing his throat. "We should probably head to bed soon," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Big day tomorrow." Ngozi nodded stiffly, hiding the sting of rejection behind a forced smile. As she retreated to her room, she felt a familiar wave of anger wash over her. Why did he always push her away? Didn't he realize how much she needed him? That night, sleep eluded her. Instead, she lay awake replaying their interactions, dissecting every word and gesture for hidden meaning. By morning, her emotions had hardened into determination. If Emeka wouldn't give her the attention she craved, she'd find a way to make him notice her, even if it meant crossing boundaries she knew she shouldn't. The next day, Ngozi deliberately left her bedroom door open while changing clothes, knowing Emeka might walk by. When he paused in the hallway, his eyes widening in surprise, she smiled innocently. "Sorry, Dad. I thought you were still in the kitchen." Emeka quickly averted his gaze, muttering something about knocking next time before hurrying away. But Ngozi saw the flicker of discomfort in his expression, and it gave her a twisted sense of satisfaction. Finally, she was getting a reaction from him, even if it wasn't the one she wanted. Unbeknownst to her, these small transgressions were setting the stage for something far more dangerous. With each step, she edged closer to a line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. One fateful evening, Chioma announced she would be traveling abroad again, this time for an extended business trip. "I'll only be gone for a couple of weeks," she said breezily, packing her suitcase without sparing a glance at her husband or daughter. "Try not to burn the house down while I'm away." Ngozi clenched her fists, biting back a sharp retort. Typical. Her mother treated them like inconveniences, obstacles to be managed rather than people who mattered. Once Chioma left, the house felt eerily quiet, the absence of her presence almost suffocating. For Ngozi, however, it was an opportunity. Without Chioma around, she and Emeka fell into their usual routine, spending hours together cooking, cleaning, and watching movies. But this time, Ngozi decided to take things further. On the third night of Chioma's trip, Ngozi joined Emeka in his bedroom under the pretense of discussing school assignments. He sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through emails on his phone, while she perched nervously beside him. For several minutes they talked about mundane topics, her grades, upcoming exams, but Ngozi's mind was elsewhere. Her heart pounded wildly as she summoned the courage to act on the feelings she'd been suppressing for so long. Before she could second-guess herself, she leaned in and kissed him, a soft, lingering press of her lips against his cheek. First there was no reaction. Then, slowly, Emeka turned to face her, his expression a mixture of shock and horror. "What are you doing?" he asked sharply, pulling away as if burned. This isn't right, Ngozi. You're my daughter." Tears sprang to her eyes, humiliation washing over her like a tidal wave. "Why do you keep pushing me away?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger and desperation. "Don't you see how much I care about you?" Emeka stood abruptly, his face pale. "No, Ngozi. This has to stop. Whatever you're feeling, it's wrong. We're family. That's all we'll ever be." His words cut deeper than any blade, leaving her reeling. How could he reject her like this? After everything they'd shared, how could he dismiss her so easily? Humiliated and enraged, Ngozi stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. That night, she lay awake plotting her revenge. If Emeka refused to acknowledge her love, then she'd make sure he paid for rejecting her. By morning, Ngozi's anger had solidified into a plan. She opened WhatsApp, scrolling through her group chat with her closest friends. They often shared gossip and secrets, bonding over stories of boys, parties, and drama. Now, Ngozi saw an opportunity to weaponize their trust. She typed out a message, her fingers shaking slightly. "Guys, something terrible happened last night. My dad, he tried to hurt me." Within seconds, replies flooded in. "What? Are you serious? Oh my God, Ngozi, are you okay? You need to tell someone. Go to the police." Reading their responses, Ngozi felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by a surge of vindictive satisfaction. Let Emeka see what it feels like to lose everything, just as he'd made her feel rejected and worthless. To make her story believable, she tore her nightdress, ripping the fabric near the neckline to mimic signs of struggle. Then, clutching it tightly, she dialed the police, her voice trembling as she recounted her fabricated tale. "My dad, he came into my room last night," she sobbed. "I don't know what to do." Within hours, officers arrived at the house, arresting Emeka as Ngozi watched silently from the doorway. His eyes met hers one last time, filled with betrayal and disbelief. And though part of her wanted to scream the truth, to beg for forgiveness, she remained silent. The lie had taken on a life of its own, and now there was no turning back. The days following Emeka's arrest felt like a blur to Ngozi. News of his alleged crime spread quickly through their community, fueled by whispers and speculation. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided eye contact, and even distant relatives distanced themselves from the scandal. The once respected Dr. Okafor was now a pariah, his name dragged through the mud. For Ngozi, the weight of her lie pressed down on her chest like a stone. She had expected some semblance of satisfaction, revenge for Emika's rejection, but instead she felt hollow. Every time she saw his face in news headlines or heard someone mention his name with disdain, guilt gnawed at her insides. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to confess. Admitting the truth would mean exposing not only her father but also her own role in destroying their lives. Her mother, Chioma, returned home immediately after hearing the news. When she confronted Ngozi, her voice was sharp with accusation. "How could you accuse your own father of such a thing? Do you have any idea what this will do to our family?" "I didn't lie," Ngozi shot back defensively, though her voice wavered. "He hurt me, Mom. He crossed a line." Chioma stared at her, disbelief etched across her features. "You expect me to believe that Emika, a man who has dedicated his life to helping others, would do something so vile? This isn't just about him, Ngozi. It's about us, about everything we've built together. And you're throwing it all away because of some teenage tantrum." "It's not a tantrum," Ngozi shouted, tears streaming down her face. "You wouldn't understand. You're never here. You don't care about us. You only care about your stupid trips and your business." Chioma flinched as if struck, her expression softening momentarily. But then anger hardened her gaze. "Don't you dare blame this on me," she snapped. "If you wanted attention, you should have come to me instead of ruining your father's life." Ngozi recoiled, her mother's words cutting deeper than intended. Was it true? Had her feelings for Emika spiraled out of control because of Chioma's neglect? The thought made her stomach churn, but she refused to admit it. Not to Chioma, not to anyone. As the trial approached, Ngozi found herself caught between two worlds: the fragile remnants of her relationship with Emika and the lies she had constructed to protect herself. Each day brought new challenges, forcing her to confront the consequences of her actions and the person she had become. Visiting Emika in prison was one of the hardest things Ngozi had ever done. Sitting across from him in the cold, sterile visiting room, she struggled to meet his eyes. Gone was the warmth and kindness she remembered. In its place was a man worn down by betrayal and despair. "Why are you here?" Emika asked finally, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Haven't you done enough?" Ngozi hesitated, her throat tightening. "I wanted to see if you were okay." Emika let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Okay. How can I be okay when my own daughter accused me of something so monstrous? Tell me, Ngozi, what did I do to deserve this?" His question hit her like a punch to the gut. What had he done? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And yet she had destroyed him, all because of her twisted feelings and wounded pride. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I wanted you to notice me, to care about me." Emika's expression softened slightly, though pain still lingered in his eyes. "I've always cared about you, Ngozi. You're my daughter. But what you're feeling, it's wrong. Dangerous. And if you don't deal with it, it'll destroy you too." His words struck a chord deep within her, forcing her to confront the reality of her situation. For years, she had justified her behavior, blaming her mother's absence and Emika's rejection. But now, sitting in that prison visiting room, she realized the truth. She had been selfish, reckless, and cruel. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted quietly, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to make it right." "You can start by telling the truth," Emika said firmly. "No matter how hard it is, no matter how much it hurts, you owe it to yourself, to me, and to everyone whose lives you've ruined." Ngozi nodded slowly, though doubt clouded her mind. Could she really undo the damage she had caused? Or was it already too late? Despite Emika's plea, Ngozi couldn't bring herself to confess. The fear of judgment from her friends, her family, and society kept her silent. Instead, she threw herself into preparing for the trial, rehearsing her fabricated testimony until it rolled off her tongue effortlessly. But the guilt continued to haunt her. At night, she dreamed of Emika's anguished face, his voice echoing in her ears. "Tell the truth." During the day, She avoided looking at her reflection in the mirror, unable to face the person staring back at her. One evening, as she scrolled through social media, she stumbled upon a post from one of her classmates. Beneath a photo of Emeka being led away in handcuffs, the caption read, "Some men truly are monsters." Ngozi's stomach churned as comments poured in, condemning Emeka without hesitation. Some called for harsh punishments, while others expressed sympathy for her, as if she were a victim rather than the architect of this tragedy. The hypocrisy of it all made her sick to her stomach. She turned off her phone and retreated to her room, curling up on her bed. For hours she lay there, staring at the ceiling as memories flooded her mind. Emeka teaching her how to ride a bike, cheering her on at school events, comforting her after nightmares. How could she have betrayed him so completely? By morning she had made a decision. She couldn't keep living like this, carrying the weight of her lies and watching her father suffer for her mistakes. Whether it was too late to save him, she didn't know. But she owed it to both of them to try. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Ngozi took the stand, her hands trembling as she placed them on the Bible. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously, and spectators leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear her testimony. For weeks, they had speculated about the case, dissecting every detail of Emeka's alleged crime. Now, all eyes were on her, the star witness. "Miss Okafor," the prosecutor began, his tone gentle yet probing. "Can you tell us what happened on the night in question?" Ngozi swallowed hard, her throat dry. This was it, the moment she had dreaded and longed for simultaneously. Taking a deep breath, she opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "Hi," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I lied." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as everyone turned to stare at her. Even the judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What did you say, Miss Okafor?" he asked sharply. Tears streamed down Ngozi's face as she forced herself to continue. "My father didn't hurt me. None of it was real. I made it up." Gasps erupted around the room, followed by urgent whispers. Emeka sat motionless in his chair, his expression unreadable. Chioma buried her face in her hands, shaking her head in disbelief. "Why would you fabricate such a story?" the prosecutor demanded, his voice rising with incredulity. Ngozi hesitated, shame burning in her chest. "Because I was angry," she admitted finally. "Angry at him for rejecting me. Angry at my mom for never being there. And scared of what people would think if they knew the truth." "And what is the truth?" the judge pressed, his tone stern. Ngozi glanced at Emeka, her heart breaking at the pain in his eyes. "The truth is, I fell in love with him, not as a father but as something more. And when he rejected me, I panicked, lashed out. I said those things to protect myself, but I never meant for it to go this far." Silence fell over the courtroom, heavy and suffocating. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Emeka stood slowly, his gaze fixed on his daughter. "Do you realize what you've done?" he asked softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just to me, but to yourself." Ngozi nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." Whether forgiveness was possible remained uncertain. But for the first time in months, Ngozi felt a flicker of hope. She had told the truth, and maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward redemption. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Ngozi's confession reverberated through the space like a thunderclap. Reporters scrambled to capture her tear-streaked face on camera, while spectators whispered furiously among themselves. Some looked at her with pity, others with disgust. But Ngozi barely noticed any of it. Her focus was entirely on Emeka, whose expression remained unreadable. As the judge called for order, Emeka slowly sank back into his seat. His shoulders slumped under the weight of everything that had transpired. Chioma, sitting beside him, turned to glare at Ngozi, her eyes blazing with fury. "How could you do this?" she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "You've ruined us all." Ngozi flinched, guilt twisting in her gut. She wanted to explain, to tell her mother that none of this would have happened if she hadn't been so absent, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply hung her head, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The judge adjourned the hearing temporarily to assess the new developments. Emeka was led out of the courtroom by bailiffs. His eyes locked on Ngozi until he disappeared behind a heavy wooden door. For the first time since the trial began, Ngozi felt a glimmer of relief. The truth was finally out, no matter how painful or destructive it might be. But as she stepped outside the courthouse, she was met with a barrage of questions from reporters and onlookers. Cameras flashed in her face, blinding her momentarily, while voices shouted over one another. "Why did you lie about your father? What made you confess now? Do you regret what you've done?" Overwhelmed, Ngozi pushed past them, her heart pounding wildly. She climbed into the waiting car Tund had arranged for her, collapsing onto the seat as tears streamed down her cheeks. The driver pulled away from the curb, leaving the chaos behind, but Ngozi knew the real storm was only beginning. Her confession might have freed Emeka legally, but it wouldn't erase the scars they both carried. And as much as she hoped for forgiveness, part of her feared it would never come. In the days following the trial, Ngozi visited Emeka again, this time without bars between them. He had been released pending further investigation into the case, though the damage to his reputation lingered like a shadow. When she arrived at his temporary apartment, he greeted her cautiously, his expression guarded yet tinged with sadness. "I didn't think you'd come," he admitted softly, gesturing for her to sit. "I wasn't sure I should," Ngozi replied, her voice trembling. "After everything I've done, I don't deserve your forgiveness." Emeka sighed deeply, running a hand over his weathered face. "Forgiveness isn't something I can give easily, Ngozi. What you did, it broke me. It shattered our family. But holding on to anger won't change the past. All it does is keep us stuck." His words resonated deeply with her, echoing the conversations they'd had before her confession. Slowly, tentatively, they began talking, not just about the trial but about everything that had led to it. Ngozi opened up about her feelings of neglect, her confusion, and her misplaced desires. Emeka listened quietly, his expression softening slightly as he pieced together the fragments of their fractured relationship. "I failed you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was being a good father, but I didn't see how lost you were. How lonely. That's on me." "No, Dad," Ngozi protested, shaking her head. "It's not your fault. None of this is your fault. I let my emotions control me and I hurt everyone because of it. You didn't fail me, I failed you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken pain and tentative hope. Finally, Emeka reached out, placing a hand on hers. "We can't undo what's been done," he said gently. "But maybe we can find a way to move forward. Together." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Rebuilding trust wasn't easy. Over the next few weeks, Ngozi and Emeka navigated their relationship with caution, each step forward accompanied by moments of hesitation and doubt. Their conversations were often awkward, punctuated by long silences and lingering tension. But despite the challenges, they persisted, determined to salvage what little remained of their bond. One evening, as they sat together watching an old Nollywood film, Ngozi found herself reflecting on how far they'd come. Just months ago, she had accused him of something unimaginable, shattering his life and theirs. Now, here they were, watching TV like any other father and daughter, albeit with scars that would never fully heal. "Do you remember this movie?" Emeka asked suddenly, nodding toward the screen. "We used to watch it all the time when you were little." Ngozi smiled faintly, memories flooding back. "Yeah, I do. You always cried during the ending. And you teased me mercilessly for it," he added with a chuckle. For the first time in what felt like forever, they shared a genuine laugh, one that wasn't tinged with bitterness or regret. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. Still, there were setbacks. Nights when Ngozi lay awake replaying her confession in court, wondering if she had done the right thing. Days when Emeka retreated into himself, overwhelmed by the weight of everything he had endured. They weren't perfect, and they never would be. But slowly, tentatively, they began to carve out a new rhythm, a fragile piece built on honesty and vulnerability. While Ngozi and Emeka worked to rebuild their relationship, tensions with Chioma remained unresolved. Since the trial, she had distanced herself from both of them, retreating into her work as if it could shield her from the emotional fallout. But Ngozi knew they couldn't move forward without addressing the elephant in the room. One afternoon, she showed up unannounced at Chioma's office, surprising her mother mid-meeting. "We need to talk," Ngozi said firmly, ignoring the irritated glances from Chioma's colleagues. Reluctantly, Chioma agreed, leading her to a private conference room. Once inside, she crossed her arms over her chest, her expression icy. "What do you want, Ngozi?" "To apologize," Ngozi replied, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "For everything. For lying about Dad. For blaming you. For letting my feelings spiral out of control." Chioma raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched across her features. "And why should I believe you? After everything you've done, why should I trust anything you say?" "Because I'm trying to make things right," Ngozi insisted, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know I messed up, Mom. I know I hurt you and Dad and myself. But I can't fix it unless we talk about it. Unless we stop pretending everything's okay when it's not." For a long moment, Chioma simply stared at her, her jaw clenched tight. Then, with a heavy sigh, she sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. "You have no idea what it's like to lose everything you've worked for," she said quietly. "To have your name dragged through the mud because of your own child's lies." "I do know," Ngozi whispered. "Because I lost everything too. My dad, my family, myself. And it's my fault. All of it." Chioma hesitated, her gaze softening slightly. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she admitted finally. "But maybe we can try to understand each other. One step at a time." It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was progress. Just as Ngozi began to feel a fragile sense of stability in her life, an unforeseen twist shattered everything she thought she knew about her family and herself. One evening, while helping Emeka sort through old boxes of photographs and documents, Ngozi stumbled upon a faded envelope tucked beneath a stack of medical journals. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably her mother's. Curious, she opened it and pulled out a letter addressed to Emeka. The date at the top placed it several months before her false accusation. Her hands trembled as she read the words scrawled across the page. "Emeka, I can't keep pretending anymore. What we have isn't working. Not for me, not for you, and certainly not for Ngozi. She's growing up too fast, and I see the way she looks at you. It's unhealthy. If we don't address this now, it'll only get worse. I know you've suspected something for a while, that there's someone else. You're right, there is. And if you won't leave me, then maybe it's time I leave you." Ngozi's breath caught in her throat. Her mother had known. Chioma had seen the signs of Ngozi's inappropriate feelings for Emeka, and instead of addressing them directly, she had used them as ammunition in their failing marriage. Worse still, Chioma had been having an affair, something neither Ngozi nor Emeka had ever suspected. "What is that?" Emeka asked, noticing the look of shock on her face. Ngozi handed him the letter silently, watching as his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "She knew," he murmured, his voice trembling. "All this time she knew." The revelation sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over Ngozi. Had her actions simply been the catalyst for a truth her parents had buried for years? Was her lie the inevitable result of a fractured marriage held together by lies and neglect? But the letter wasn't the only bombshell. As Ngozi continued digging through the box, she found another document, a paternity test report dated shortly after her birth. Her heart stopped as she scanned the results. Exclusion probability, 99.99%. She stared at the paper, her vision blurring with tears. The man she had accused of unspeakable acts, the man she had loved so desperately, wasn't even her biological father. Ngozi confronted Emeka immediately, her voice shaking with rage and betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, shoving the paternity test into his hands. "Why did you let me believe you were my father all these years?" Emeka's face paled as he read the document, his hands trembling. I wanted to protect you," he admitted finally, his voice breaking. "When Chioma told me the truth, I was devastated. But I couldn't abandon you, not when you needed me most. So I stayed. I raised you as my own because I loved you, Ngozi. Still do. But you're not my father," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "You lied to me. Just like everyone else." "I didn't lie to hurt you," Emeka pleaded, reaching out to touch her arm. "I lied because I wanted to give you a stable home, a family. Your real father, he left before you were born. He didn't want anything to do with you, or Chioma." The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. Everything she had built her identity around, her love for Emeka, her anger toward Chioma, even her false accusation, was based on a lie. She wasn't just the daughter who had betrayed her father. She was the product of a man who had rejected her before she took her first breath. Overwhelmed, Ngozi fled the apartment, leaving Emeka alone with his guilt. She wandered aimlessly through Lagos, her mind reeling. How could she reconcile the man she had loved so deeply with the knowledge that he wasn't her father? And what did this mean for her feelings, for her entire existence? As she stood on the edge of Third Mainland Bridge, staring into the murky waters below, a chilling realization washed over her. The lies she had lived with weren't just hers. They belonged to everyone she had ever trusted. That night, Ngozi returned home to find Chioma waiting for her. For once, her mother's usual composure was gone, replaced by raw vulnerability. "We need to talk," Chioma said softly, her voice tinged with desperation. "About your father. About everything." Ngozi hesitated, unsure whether she could handle another revelation. But curiosity, and perhaps a sliver of hope for closure, compelled her to sit down. "I never told you who your real father was," Chioma began, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "His name was Adebowale Adenuga. He was complicated, charismatic but cruel. When I found out I was pregnant, he made it clear he didn't want anything to do with us. So I turned to Emeka. He agreed to raise you as his own, even though it meant sacrificing his pride. And you repaid him by cheating on him," Ngozi shot back bitterly. "By lying to both of us." Chioma flinched, guilt flashing across her features. "I made mistakes, Ngozi. Terrible ones. But I did what I thought was best, for you, for our family. I never imagined it would end like this." Ngozi shook her head, her chest heaving with emotion. "It doesn't matter anymore. Nothing does. Because none of this is real. None of us are who we claimed to be." With that, she stormed out of the house, unable to bear the suffocating weight of their shared secrets. That night, she packed a bag and disappeared, leaving behind the wreckage of her former life. For weeks, Ngozi drifted through Lagos, staying in cheap hostels and avoiding contact with anyone from her past. She cut off her phone, deleted her social media accounts, and adopted a new identity, anything to escape the ghosts that haunted her. But no matter how far she ran, the memories followed her like shadows. One evening, as she sat alone in a dimly lit cafe, a familiar voice startled her. "Ngozi." She turned to see Tund standing behind her, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, pulling up a chair. "But I couldn't let you disappear without trying to help." Tund listened quietly as Ngozi poured out her heart, recounting everything that had happened: the paternity test, Chioma's affair, her own recklessness. By the time she finished, tears streamed freely down her face. "You can't keep running," Tund said gently. "Facing the truth is hard, but hiding won't fix anything. But what if the truth destroys me? Ngozi whispered, her voice breaking. Maybe it will, Tund replied honestly. Or maybe it'll set you free. His words lingered in her mind long after he left. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider returning, not to the life she had fled, but to the possibility of redemption. When Ngozi finally returned home, she found Emeka sitting on the porch, his face lined with worry. I thought I'd lost you, he admitted, pulling her into a tight embrace. I almost lost myself, Ngozi replied, her voice thick with emotion. But I'm here now. And I want to make things right. Together they began the painstaking process of rebuilding. Not just their relationship but their understanding of who they were. Ngozi reached out to Chioma, initiating tentative conversations about forgiveness and healing. Though progress was slow, each step forward felt like a victory. But the scars remained. Some wounds, they realized, might never fully heal. And yet, amidst the pain, there was hope, a fragile, flickering light guiding them toward a future where honesty, not lies, defined their lives. Years later, Ngozi stood on the balcony of her modest apartment, watching the sun rise over Lagos. The city buzzed with its usual chaos, but within her, there was a quiet peace. She had spent years grappling with guilt, shame, and regret, but she had also learned resilience, forgiveness, and the power of truth. Beside her stood Emeka, older but still kind, still patient. Thank you for coming back, he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. I don't know what I would have done without you. I should be thanking you, Ngozi replied, smiling faintly. You gave me a second chance, even when I didn't deserve it. As they watched the sunrise together, Ngozi realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing to move forward, imperfectly, painfully, but with purpose. And for the first time in years, she believed in the possibility of a brighter tomorrow.